Perhaps one of the most beautiful passages in Scripture is Colossians 3, verse 11. There in chapter 3 of his letter, Paul writes, "Here there is not Greek and Jew, circumcised and uncircumcised, barbarian, Scythian, slave, free, but Christ is all and in all." The picture he's creating is of a church that is incredibly diverse, but is united by only one thing, by one person, by Jesus Christ. He's painting a picture of a church that has different histories and different cultures and different politics and different beliefs. And yet Christ and Christ alone is enough to hold them together. It's a beautiful picture. But it's also a really challenging picture. And I'm convinced that one of the ways that Paul reminds us of the challenge of this picture is by dropping a single word into the text. Scythians. Right there in the church in Colossae, there are Scythians. You see, all throughout history and every time and every place, we have divided the world up. And the primary way that we divide the world up is into us and them. And so the Greeks in this passage, they divided the world up into Greeks and into not Greeks, or Greeks and barbarians. Because all of those languages that they heard around them that they didn't understand, they just sounded like barbarians. And the Jews in this passage, they divided the world up too, into us and into them. Into us Jews, the circumcised, who bear in our body the marks of God's promise. And the uncircumcised, the outsiders, the them, the not us. And into this passage, Paul drops a word, or maybe better an idea. Right there in the church in Colossae, there are Scythians. The Scythians were a people group that lived to the north and west of the Black Sea. In other words, not all that far from the Colossians that Paul is writing to. But about 400 years before Paul sat down and wrote this letter, the Scythians had been displaced by a group of people called the Sarmatians, so that they moved even further to the north and to the west. So that by the time Paul writes in the first century, the Scythians are more idea than reality. They are more about a group of stories that circulates around an almost legendary people. These fierce, long-haired horsemen, who were the most vile of the vile, the most violent of the violent, the most barbarous of all the barbarians. You see it? It's these Scythians that are in the church in Colossae. So it's not just a beautiful picture to have people united by Christ and by Christ alone. It's also an incredibly difficult reality. Because sometimes Scythians, they act like Scythians. Sometimes Greeks, they act like Greeks. And sometimes Jews, they act like Jews. And pretty soon there's friction in the midst of things. When I was going to seminary, one of my classmates was a Brazilian. And he told me a story about a Brazilian church that was given permission to meet in a long-established church in the city that had German roots. And everything went along swimmingly at first, but pretty soon the Brazilians, they began to act like Brazilians, and the Germans, they began to act like Germans, and it created this friction. It created friction around things like, volume. Because Brazilians, they worship in a particular way, and it's louder than the Germans were used to. And so they were somewhat bothered, these Germans, by the sounds that they heard coming from their church on Sunday afternoon after their own service was over. In fact, some of them who lived in the neighborhood had to close the windows of their houses so that they could take their Sunday afternoon naps unbothered by the noise that was coming from the Brazilians. And over the long decades that this German group had established their church in the city, they had also established a particular order, a particular way of doing things, just simple things like maintaining the building. And it wasn't like the Brazilians didn't clean up after themselves or weren't respectful of the space. It's just they didn't know the way that the Germans expected it to be done. And so you found people dealing with these tensions in different ways. And one of the ways that the tensions were dealt with is by the janitor, the German janitor, who decided to clean the church on Sunday afternoon during the Brazilian worship service, and it's not like he deliberately chose the loudest vacuum in his arsenal in the cleaning closet, but he sure didn't choose the quietest vacuum either. And when he fired it up right during the middle of the sermon, he realized what was going on, and rather than stopping, he just smirked. And when he told the story to some others, they smirked as well. You see, there's this thing that happens. Sometimes on really simple, minor levels, where friction is created when you bring together barbarians and Greeks and Scythians and slaves and free and circumcised and uncircumcised, and you put them into one body and you insist that they are held together by Christ, there are automatically tensions, friction, struggles, conflict. So as well as being one of the most beautiful verses in the Bible, this verse, it also creates a question. Our question is, how do you make it work? How do you actually make it work when you bring together all these different people with all these different opinions, all these different ways of doing things, and you put them into a church? I think Paul wants us to ask that question, because he actually begins to flesh out an answer for us immediately after painting a picture of the church. This is the way that Paul fleshes out his answer. It's in Colossians chapter 3, beginning in verse 12. He says, "Put on then as God's chosen ones, holy and beloved, compassionate hearts, kindness, humility, meekness, and patience, bearing with one another. And if one has a complaint against another, forgiving each other. As the Lord has forgiven you, so you also must forgive. And above all these things, put on love, which binds everything together in perfect harmony. And let the peace of Christ rule in your hearts, to which indeed you were called in one body, and be thankful. Let the word of Christ dwell in you richly, teaching and admonishing one another in all wisdom, singing psalms and hymns and spiritual songs with thankfulness in your hearts to God. And whatever you do, in word or deed, do everything in the name of the Lord Jesus, giving thanks to God the Father through him." We are people who live our lives in an incredible hurry. Even when we're doing nothing, we're in a hurry. So that people who create television know that they have roughly 20 seconds to hook us. And if they haven't got us within that 20 seconds, we'll change the channel, or we'll go back to the Netflix menu and keep scrolling. We're people who are in a hurry. And so we want to race through this passage. We want to get to the answers. What's the solution to the frictions and the tensions that we experience? But we can't race through it. We need to slow down. Put on then, as God's chosen ones, holy and beloved. Don't go any farther than there just yet. I know you want to say, well, what is it that we're supposed to put on? But first of all, remember who you are. God's chosen ones, holy and beloved. We get, over the course of our lives, all kinds of identities, labels attached to us. We claim all kinds of identities. What we do, where we come from, how much we make, who our family is, our hobbies, all of these things can become for us identities. But Paul says, this is who you are. This is your identity. God's chosen ones, holy and beloved. So act like it, I guess we could say. Or better yet, remember it. Remember when you're in the midst of the frictions and tensions of life, of church, of being this united body together, that you are God's chosen ones, holy and beloved. And remember that phrase is plural. It's not just me that's chosen, and it's not just you that's chosen. It's us together. It's ones. The person with whom you are so fiercely disagreeing is God's chosen one. Now that we know who we are, we can continue. We can begin to think about the things that Paul is calling us to put on. He says, compassionate hearts, kindness, humility, meekness, and patience, bearing with one another. It's a pretty common thing in the New Testament, perhaps particularly in the writings of Paul, to have a list of virtues. What Paul is doing is getting us to think about each of these things individually, but more important, he's giving us a big, well-rounded picture of the kinds of people that we are supposed to be. The individual virtues are important, but more important is Paul is saying, this is who you are. And he often does that, this is who you are, in contrast to this is who you aren't. These are the kinds of things that you put off, and these are the kinds of things that you put on. He does it here by giving us a list of vices to put off in chapter 3, verse 5. Put to death, therefore, whatever is earthly in you, sexual immorality, impurity, passion, evil desire, and covetousness, which is idolatry. These are the things you put off. This is not who you are. This is not your identity. This is not the kind of person you are. And these things, compassionate hearts, kindness, humility, meekness, bearing with one another, this is who you are. It's worth noting that the picture of who Christians are to be in the first century wasn't entirely positive. Not everybody would have looked at that picture and said, yeah, that's who we're supposed to be. Instead, they would have said, well, that's kind of strange, or that's kind of wrong. In particular, perhaps, they would have noted humility. That wasn't a virtue in the first century. Humility was a necessity for the people who were at the bottom of the social ladder. But the whole idea was to move your way up so that you didn't need to be humble anymore. Instead, you could be proud of your status, your position, where you ranked. It's worth noting that the picture isn't entirely positive. And we need to pause and think about that for a moment. Because we are quick to say that, well, for us, that's a positive picture. That's exactly the kind of people that we want to be. But I think the way that we act so often reveals that this is not the kind of people that we want to be. We don't really think that Paul is giving good, practical advice for dealing with tension and friction in the life of the church. Because we so often choose different ways. Right? We choose the loudest vacuum in the closet and we fire it up in the middle of the Brazilian church's sermon, because that will bring our message across. Not compassionate hearts and kindness and humility and bearing with one another in love. That doesn't really work. We don't seek to walk with one another in grace. We seek to make our point. And then eventually what happens? Well, the Scythians, they learn that they're not really welcome here. So they take their ball and go home, and the church becomes divided, and we say, well, maybe it's better that way anyways. They can be there with their people who they get along with, and we can be here with our people who we get along with. Think of the ways that the church becomes divided. And think how ridiculous those look through the eyes of history. Can you imagine if the church in Colossae became divided into Scythians and non-Scythians, into barbarians and Greeks? Those divisions, they no longer matter in the course of history because they don't even exist. These labels don't even exist, but Jesus still does. And it's Jesus that they're supposed to be united around. Can you imagine how foolish it looks through the eyes of history to be divided over politics? Conservative or liberal or Republican or Democrat to the south. Ultimately, these things won't even matter. They won't even continue to exist, but Jesus will. So how foolish will it be if these are the things that unite us and not Jesus? So we can't do it. We can't do what we so often do and just try to convince people we're right and just try to bully our way through until we get what we want. Because it's contrary to the picture of the church that Paul paints for us in Colossians. It's contrary to the work that Jesus did to create one new people out of the many. We need to work at staying together, even in the midst of our tensions and frictions and heartaches and pains. And that's the problem, isn't it? We say, well, this stuff, it works for the minor stuff, like the volume of the music, or when and how to clean the church. This being kind and compassionate and humble, it works for the minor stuff. But what about the really big stuff? What about the stuff where people have really hurt us? What about the stuff that has led to us being really honestly wounded? What about when people sin? This is Paul's answer. He says that we are to forgive each other. As the Lord has forgiven you, so you also must forgive. This is a pretty common idea for us as Christians, that our being forgiven by God is tied to our forgiveness of others. The idea is, if we who have been forgiven everything by God, if we who stand by Him only on the merit of His grace and forgiveness and generosity to us, can actually go to somebody else and refuse to forgive, it shows that we don't understand who we are, that we don't understand how much we've been forgiven, that we don't understand how gracious God has been to us. If we can't forgive others, it shows that we haven't fully received the forgiveness that God has extended towards us. So here's what you do in the church when there are big things that really hurt, things that really wound. You forgive. You extend grace. Nice picture. But in reality, it's really hard. And the first question we ask about this hard picture is, well, then nobody's going to change. And then nobody's going to grow up. Then they're never really going to learn. But that's not what Paul has in mind. His picture of grace isn't one where we just get away with things. His picture of grace isn't one where we just continue to bump up against each other, inflicting pain in our sinfulness. No, Paul says. Instead, he says that the peace of Christ should rule in your hearts, to which indeed you were called in one body, and be thankful. Let the word of Christ dwell in you richly, teaching and admonishing one another in all wisdom, singing psalms and hymns and spiritual songs, with thankfulness in your hearts to God. Here's the idea, is that somebody who sins can actually be taught, can actually be admonished, can actually be corrected. And the reason that can happen is because in the church we are committed to each other. You know, I was thinking of some of the different ways that my kids are growing up compared to the way that I grew up. And I had this experience as a kid that my kids will never have because, well, now we use our phones to text and not to talk. But back in the day when you could only talk on the phone, I would find maybe my mom saying something to me like, "You practice piano, and you practice piano right now, or so help me." And then the phone would ring. And my mom would answer, not, "What do you want?" but, "Hello?" Always in the kindest, friendliest voice. And there's a couple reasons, I'm sure, why she did that. But one of the reasons that she did that, one of the reasons she behaved differently towards me than the person on the other end of the phone is because we had a relationship. A relationship that was founded on some of the things that Paul writes about here: compassion and kindness and humility and meekness and patience. Because we were committed to each other in these things, she could teach and admonish and correct and get really straight forward because we're committed. And if we're not committed to each other, if there is none of this foundational level of compassion and kindness and humility and gentleness and forgiveness, then we always have to keep the rough stuff hidden. Then we always have to keep the rough stuff to ourselves. But that's not the picture of the church. At least it's not a biblical one. Our unity isn't this soft thing where we sit around and everybody's nice and we always hold hands and we always get along and we sing Kumbaya. Our unity isn't a soft thing. Instead, our unity has the strength of steel. We are committed to it, committed to going even through the rough things together. We're committed to this picture of unity, not because it's easy, but because it's good. And because this picture of unity is good, it's worth it. It's worth putting on compassion, kindness, humility, meekness, and patience.